Well, as we continue down Route 66, we're almost through the state of Kansas, all 13.2 miles of it. And remember, we've been through Galena and Riverton, and we stopped last week and took a look at the Marsh Arch Bridge. And so this morning, we are going to stop in Baxter Springs. Anybody ever been to Baxter Springs? Anybody know what it's famous for? Okay, well, it used to be called the most robbed town in America, and there's a reason for that. Let me see if I can show you some of the pictures. So there's that. Okay, right here I'm going to show you the cafe. This is a little cafe that's on the main drag through there, cafe on Route 66. This used to be a bank, and it was famous because Jesse James robbed the bank. And so that was part of, the most robbed part of the whole thing. But also, this was a town where Bonnie and Clyde came through, robbed the bank, went somewhere else, came back through, robbed the bank again, went somewhere else. And so this was you didn't want your money in the banks, I guess, in Baxter Springs. But anyway, it was a wild cow town after the Civil War, and these days it's pretty tame, I'm sure. And our corresponding book, of course, that's the little visitor center, an old renovated old Phillips 66 station. And our corresponding book, obviously, is the book of Ecclesiastes, the fourth out of 5 books of what we have been calling Old Testament poetry. One more to go, and then we launch into an entire series through the prophets, which should be pretty interesting. A little bit about the background on Ecclesiastes. Right out of the beginning, this is what we're told: the words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. And then the big theme of the book: meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless, everything is meaningless. Cheery, isn't it? Just something you can kind of hold on to through the day. Actually, very important, and we'll be looking at this phrase because it occurs repeatedly throughout the book, but in a sense, you can almost understand the big message of the whole book simply in the first 2 verses of the book and the last 2 verses of the book. And I'm not going to tell you and spoil what is in the last 2 verses, but the rest of the book sort of spans the gap between these kind of 2 endpoints. The title of the book comes from the Hebrew word koheleth, and it's an interesting word. Sometimes it's translated as teacher, sometimes it's translated as preacher. The word, and of course Solomon is identifying himself by using this word. The word, the literal meaning is one who addresses the assembly. And that's where kind of this idea of one that stands up in front and is addressing the assembly. Sometimes it's a teacher, sometimes a preacher. And then our title, Ecclesiastes, actually comes from the Greek translation, and the meaning of this word, Ecclesiastes, is the same thing: one who addresses the assembly. But the assembly comes from the word in Greek, ecclesia, which is the word in your Bibles that throughout the New Testament is translated church. So, but the word church or ecclesia literally means a gathered assembly. And so Ecclesiastes, again, the one who stands in front and addresses that assembly. And so Solomon identifies himself as that person. And of course, we know that from our studies back in Kings and Chronicles, again, and looking at what we did last week, and our next book is also a book written by Solomon. But again, King of Israel, kind of roughly time frame when this would have been written, somewhere between 970 BC and 930 BC. And when you study the book and reflect upon it, you get a sense that probably written somewhere maybe closer to the end of Solomon's life, because it's a book where Solomon reflects back on a lot of his achievements and accomplishments. Either that, or he's kind of going through maybe some sort of a midlife crisis as he's looking at everything he's engaged in and assessing that. But it's amazing because it is a book that is so relevant to the times in which we live. I used to tell people Solomon is like the first modern man. He pursued all of the things that in our culture we're told are the things to pursue if you want to have a happy life. And Solomon pursued them, and we're going to see that. And then he achieved them at a level most of us will never achieve. And then he stopped and took a look at all of these things and reached a certain assessment, which again, we will look at. Just in the for what it's worth category, it's a book that is read annually in the Jewish community during the Feast of Tabernacles. And kind of an interesting context because, again, Tabernacles is sort of the most joyful of all of the Jewish feasts. It's almost like a week-long party. And this is a good book in the midst of that to sort of reflect upon life. Main theme, should not surprise us, wisdom, because it's part of the wisdom literature. But whereas we defined wisdom last week as skill in living and how Proverbs gave all of these little jewels and gems about, how to live in a wise way, especially this book, The Sense of Wisdom, and I said this last week, but I'll say it again, is that part of what wisdom is that it was the ability to distinguish between that which is trivial and that which is fundamental. In other words, wisdom, it really knows what's truly important in life and what just isn't all that important. And this is certainly what Solomon attempts to do in this book. And it's a message, again, communicated by him telling of his accomplishments and really how that those accomplishments, and I'm going to throw a little spin on this because I think there's a lot of truth to this, but how apart from God and apart from having the right priorities, that his accomplishments were all just striving after the wind is the expression. That's a great expression, by the way. Chasing after the wind. I was thinking, have you ever done that? Have you ever gone out and tried to chase the wind? I mean, most of us haven't, because you'd think, well, that would be dumb. And that's kind of what the book is saying, that if you just pour your life into these things, it's a little dumb, because it's just like you can't quite get your hands on it. And that word, by the way, and so again, he's going to come back. This is going to be his assessment. I've seen all the things that are done under the sun, and all of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. The Hebrew word, it's interesting because the essence of the Hebrew word it is that it means breath or vapor. And so the idea of him saying, in the old King James, vanity, vanity, all is vanity, or here, as it's translated, probably one of the better translations in the NIV, meaningless. It's the idea that somehow there are things in our life that they just don't have substance, okay? And that idea of substance or gravity was was something that the Jewish culture really placed a lot of value on, to live your life in a way that is substantive rather than living your life in a way that really is just kind of meaningless. So here's how the book breaks down. Two big sections in the book, and I'm going to give them my own little names this morning. The first section I'm simply going to call the Solomon Syndrome, because I wrote a book called The Solomon Syndrome. It's out of print. You can get it used on Amazon, but it really takes Ecclesiastes and goes into some depth on this. But the Solomon Syndrome has to do with those pursuits that Solomon engaged in that ultimately led to a meaningless life, or were meaningless. And then the second part of the book, which is probably obviously, I don't know if it's more important, but the second half I'm simply going to call the Solomon Solution. And that is that what we're going to find in this book, and they're woven in here. I mean, it's a complex book if you've never read it, but woven in there, he gives some tips about what are the things that are important, or what are some things that can make our lives more meaningful than simply pursuing the things that ultimately are meaningless. So, 5 big pursuits and then 5 tips that are in the book. So, pursuit number 1 is power. And this is not quite as overt, perhaps, as some of the other pursuits we're going to see, but obviously he begins by identifying himself as the king in Jerusalem. A little further down in that same chapter, he's going to say, I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. Solomon was the king of Israel during its golden age. And he possessed an incredible amount of power. I guess you could think that any monarch, obviously, it's the ultimate power rests in the king in most countries, but he possessed that power at really the height of Israel's golden age. In a sense, David did all the work, and Solomon really reaped the benefits. And so, again, think about this. He's the absolute monarch of a major world kingdom at the height of its glory. Not much more power than that. And this is, I don't know if you want to call this an achievement, but it's the first thing that he assesses. And following this statement, he makes sort of one of his early assessments that I've seen all things that are done under the sun, and all of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. So the pursuit of power, it doesn't deliver what it promises. And honestly, you think about it, and I think we probably all are aware of this, but really some of the most powerful men and women on the planet are really some of the most miserable. I mean, you can see that it doesn't really deliver what our heart longs for, I think. So, pursuit number 1, power. Pursuit number 2, knowledge. And this goes along with the wisdom theme, but it's a little bit more than that. So, we know that Solomon was the wisest man that had ever walked the face of the earth, the scriptures say. Jesus Christ is the only one after Solomon that would be wiser or more intelligent than Solomon was, but you can kind of think of him as the most educated, the most intelligent man of his age. And as he reflects upon that, it's kind of interesting because he goes into one of his early little asides where he looks at the fact that, I pursued wisdom. Let me see what I've got here in the text. I applied my mind to study and to explore by wisdom all that's done under the heavens, and what a heavy burden God has laid on mankind. And then he reflects on the fact that whether you're wise or you're a fool, the fact is we're all going to die. And then when he looks at that fact and his pursuit here of knowledge, he comes again to that same kind of a conclusion. He says, look, I've increased in wisdom more than anyone who's ruled over Jerusalem before me. I've experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. I saw that wisdom's better than folly, just as light is better than darkness. The wise have eyes in their heads while the fool walks in darkness. But I came to realize that the same fate overtakes them both, which again is the fate that both are going to die. So there's a sense that his pursuit of knowledge, and let me see. Then I said to myself, the fate of the fool will overtake me also. What then do I gain by being wise? I said to myself, this too is meaningless. Now, if you go through the book, by the way, it is very complex. And actually, if it's your first reading, you might think, this guy is contradicting himself left and right, because it seems like he'll make one statement and he'll make a statement a little bit later that seems to contradict it. And really, throughout the ages, and I've gone back and just looked at some of the interpreters and commentators, and even way back in the early Jewish era, when they were writing books about Ecclesiastes, there were theories. Is this all Solomon speaking, or are there times when it's the fool that's actually speaking and Solomon responding to it? But you do get this sense that there's a lot of ambivalence in the book, And I've got to say, I think the world we live in is kind of like that, isn't it? There is sort of a lot of tension and ambivalence in the world in which we live. But again, he says, it's all meaningless, but in the same breath, he kind of says that, but it's better to be wise than to be a fool. Anyway, so again, knowledge doesn't quite deliver perhaps what the promise is. Many of us, I don't even think this is exactly true in these days, and young men and women that are heading off to college. I don't think that the message is the same as the one that many of us got. Because I see a lot of times now people saying, well, maybe college isn't for everyone, and or do you really want to go to college and come out with all of this debt and can't get a job? Back when Solomon and I were going to school, education, it was like an idol, wasn't it? It was like this is the key, to the good life. And there's certainly a degree to which that is true, but it's not the thing that makes life meaningful. And again, I would say, and many of you probably, if you would think back on some of your, professors at university, really some of the most educated men and women on the planet are also some of the most miserable. I mean, it's like, this didn't give what, again, the heart is sort of longing for. So, second pursuit, knowledge. Third pursuit, which Solomon was really good at, was the pursuit of pleasure. And we live in a very hedonistic society, so we ought to be able to, at least kind of resonate with this. And so he makes these amazing statements. I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find what is good. I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives. I acquired male and female singers and a harem as well, the delights of a man's heart. I did not, I'm going to go back there. Let's see. This is an amazing verse. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. I mean, think about it. This was a guy that had the capacity and the means to make that statement true. Anything he wanted, he had the capacity to get. We know, by the way, in Kings, when we were going through Kings, that he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. He had quite a harem. He makes a little statement that he had a harem. But again, whatever it was, whatever you could do to experience, again, some kind of sensuality and pleasure, he denied himself none of that. And then, in the end, he assesses that pursuit. But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is madness. And what does pleasure accomplish? Pretty interesting statement. Now, let me go on. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I'd toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless. A chasing after the wind, nothing was gained under the sun. So again, pleasure didn't deliver what he was looking for. The fourth pursuit, it was the pursuit of possessions. And he had serious stuff, guys. I mean, when you look at what this guy, what his possessions looked like, again, along with the fact that in the pleasure category he denied himself nothing, he didn't deny himself anything in the area of material possessions either. He talks about it here again in the second chapter. I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself, palaces, palaces, planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. And then go back, because this isn't in Ecclesiastes, but this is what we were told back in 1 Kings. Solomon accumulated chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses. This was like cars, guys. okay? It's like, how many cars do you have? Well, I've got 5 or 6. Oh, that's pretty cool. I have 1,400, you know? He had to build entire cities just to keep his chariots, okay? So, I mean, again, it's hard to imagine the incomprehensible amount of his possessions, which he kept in chariot cities and also with him in Jerusalem. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and cedar as plentiful as sycamore fig trees in the foothills. And so, again, amazing accomplishment, and then he assesses it. And here's what he says: as goods increase, so do those who consume them. And what benefit are they to the owners except to feast their eyes on them? I don't know if I go on here. Yeah, this is kind of a good one. God gives some people wealth, possessions, and honor, so they lack nothing their hearts desire, but God doesn't grant them the ability to enjoy them. And strangers enjoy them instead. This is meaningless, a grievous evil. And again, I mean, all of you probably could say that you know that there are some people that have so much material possessions it's hard to even imagine, and they just aren't happy. You know, as a matter of fact, I kind of think what Solomon is kind of saying there is the more stuff you have, the more time you got to invest sort of taking care of it. Have you ever noticed that? You know, that things seem to, you know, require a lot of energy sometimes. And again, the other part of this, I think, is that, you know, back in elementary, your kind of beginning economics classes, you might remember something called the law of diminishing returns. And the concept is quite simple. It's like, okay, I eat an ice cream cone, and man, I have never had an ice cream cone like this in my life. And then I eat 2 or 3 more ice cream cones, and by about the 10th ice cream cone, it's really not quite as good as that first. And by the time you hit 100 ice cream cones, you know, there's no pleasure in it at all. And that's a principle. And so think about that. So the more we accumulate, oftentimes the very things we accumulate give us less pleasure than they did when we only had just a few things that we could really enjoy and appreciate. And so, again, the possessions just don't really meet the need of the human heart. Now, kind of ties into his next pursuit, which is wealth itself. And Solomon tells us this: I amassed silver and gold, the treasures of kings and provinces. Back in 1 Kings, by the way, there are a number of actual figures that are given to us. One says that his annual income was, it's kind of an interesting number, 666 talents of gold. And then it's in that same section there is when the Queen of Sheba comes to visit him. And when she comes to visit, she brings a gift of 120 more talents of gold. And then it tells us that he sent out ships, you know, that were out doing commerce. And every 3 years, they would come back, and we aren't given even the exact amounts, but again, would come back with tremendous wealth in gold. And I took these numbers, and I think this is conservative, and I did kind of an interesting thing. I didn't just try to take those numbers. So for instance, like 666 talents of gold, I think is about 45 tons of gold. And rather than just taking that and figuring it in terms of what the price of gold would be today, I kind of did something a little different. I went back and took, what did gold and silver, what did they accomplish, at least in the time of Jesus? I couldn't quite get the same kind of information about the time of Solomon, but for instance, we know that at the time of Jesus that a day's wage was for a working man was about a denarius, and we know that a denarius was worth about a ½ ounce of silver. So taking these things to try and get some sort of a sense of what was his net worth really like, very conservatively, not counting real estate holdings, etc., I estimate that Solomon's worth was well over $1 trillion. Now, to put that in context, it's kind of interesting. This week, Forbes came out with its list of the richest people in the world. These are the 3 richest people in the world according to Forbes. And if you take their worth of the 3 of them and add it together, it comes out to about $235 billion. Solomon had 5 times the wealth of these guys combined. I mean, he had unbelievable wealth. And then, yet he goes and he assesses it. And his assessment is pretty simple. Whoever loves money never has enough. Have you noticed that? I've noticed this about myself, Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied. Now, by the way, the key word in here, do you pick it up? Loves money, loves wealth, because there's nothing wrong with money. And I'm going to come back and reiterate this again. There's nothing wrong with any of these pursuits unless they become the driving passion and priority of our life. And when that happens, what was intended by God to be a means to an end has become an end in and of itself. And when that happens, I think this is what Solomon is saying. It becomes meaningless because, it's all right to have, there's nothing wrong with power, there's nothing wrong with possessions, there's nothing wrong with wealth. But again, they aren't the things that really meet the deepest needs in our life. And so Solomon, even his wealth, he comes to the conclusion this: yet when I surveyed all my hands had done, what I toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. And then he makes a fascinating statement a little bit later in this chapter, if I got it. So I hated life. Can you imagine? Look at what the guy had. And yet, it doesn't get it done. I hated life because the work that's done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it's meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Well, you kind of put it together and here's what it's saying: power, pleasure, possessions, wealth. Solomon had it all to an extent we can hardly imagine, but the result was it didn't meet the need for meaning in his life. It was a vapor, it was a breath, it was just things that had no substance. So, takeaway is this: avoid the Solomon syndrome. Kind of simple, isn't it? I mean, why did God stick this book in the Bible? Because really, you read the thing and you should ask that question until you get to the final chapter, because it's kind of, and I think that God allowed Solomon to accomplish these things to the extent that he did to try and, give us a heads up that, hey, you need to be careful. Well, what's the solution to this syndrome? And I'm going to dig in and pull out 5 little tips. Again, you should read the book if you didn't read it this week, because again, there's a complexity to it that I'm simplifying. But in the midst of this, I think there are some tips that God gives us about how to live a more meaningful life. And I'm calling it the Solomon Solution, which is the book I didn't write. And anyway, it's just like an inside deal for me right there. Anyway, actually, the second half of the book is sort of the solution. So what's the solution? Here's tip number 1. Cultivate perspective. I think that's what the 3rd chapter of Ecclesiastes tells us to do. To everything there is a season. By the way, interesting little background on that song. The Byrds didn't write the song. Pete Seeger wrote the song. Actually, there's been a couple of things added, I think, in the Byrds version. I think Pete Seeger was directly nothing added other than the turn, turn, turn part. He wrote it in the 50s. The first person that actually recorded it was Judy Collins, and she put it out on an album in 1963, and it had been, this, by the way, is 60s trivia for all of my baby boomer buddies here, okay? Anyway, so, but her version had been arranged by a guy that was in a group called the Limelighters. Now, the Limelighters precede me. They're an old folk group. But one of the guys in the group was a guy named Roger McGuinn. And Roger McGuinn did the arrangement for Judy Collins. Then the Limelighters recorded it. And then Roger McGuinn and other guys started a group called the Byrds. And the Byrds, of course, made it famous in 1965. So anyway, but again, there's some perspective in there. There's a time for everything, and there's a sense in which, that the writer there, that Solomon is sort of stepping back and kind of realizing, you need to have a certain perspective on life. And again, my sense being that there's nothing wrong with what he's talked about prior to this, but there are other things that are more important, and we need to begin to cultivate that kind of a perspective, which I think is just a biblical mindset on life and materialism and all of these other issues that Solomon dealt with. So cultivate perspective. Out of that, I think the second tip in here, that's the verse. I think the second tip is then to prioritize relationships. You see, you'll notice throughout in the book that there are mentions of relationships and how, if you can enjoy some of these things, that it's a gift of God. The fourth chapter has sort of another sort of classic section, much like the third chapter has the turn stuff. You'll hear this at weddings all the time. And there, Solomon writes, 2 are better than 1 because they have a good reward for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. Also, if 2 lie down together, they'll keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, 2 can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. That's an encouragement to relationship. Do you pick up on that? Okay, being alone, and I've got to think Solomon. Don't you think he probably had to feel like a loner to a certain extent? I mean, I can't imagine that he didn't. But he's encouraging here. Hey, it's better to be in relationship. There are things that can't happen unless you're in relationship. And I think that's one of the huge messages of the Bible, that relationships are the things that give life true joy and meaning and purpose. He talks about family and marriage in the text too. Enjoy life with your wife whom you love. And so again, focus on relationships. I think there might be more. Yeah, and it's a little humorous what he adds to that. All the days of this meaningless life. Okay, enjoy your wife all the days of the meaningless life, okay, that God has given you under the sun, all your meaningless days, okay? So anyway, so there's a kind of again, I think a message in there, and certainly it's the message of Jesus. So Jesus is asked, what's the greatest commandment? And basically what he says is what Solomon is saying here. He says, well, it's to love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And then he says, all the law and the prophets hinge on this. Now, what is he saying there? Relationships. That we're created to have a relationship with God and to love Him and experience His love. And we're created to live in community and to have relationships with one another and to learn how to love each other. And that it's in relationship where some of those deepest needs are met and where life finds its meaning. So I think that's a good tip, to prioritize relationships. Tip number 3, we should all like. The book actually says you should enjoy life. Now, this hasn't always been the mindset of either the Jewish community or the church, maybe the church a little bit more. There's a balance here. And again, the balance is that we aren't to live lives as hedonists. In other words, that the whole passion and pursuit of our life is pleasure and trying to enjoy things, that's out of balance. But on the other hand, I really think that we aren't to live our lives with the objective of denying pleasure and joy. And see, that's where the pendulum has swung often, is that in response perhaps to too much materialism, Certainly, you see this, probably one of the vivid examples when the Christian church became the official state church in the 4th century. It became very enmeshed within that Roman culture, and it became wealthy. And the response to that by a lot of Christians was they headed off into the deserts of Egypt. And you have the whole story of the Desert Fathers and asceticism and that the pursuit of life somehow hinged upon what you didn't do and what you didn't experience. And I think that's a little out of balance. So the tip is enjoy your life. And it's a gift to enjoy it. This is what I've observed to be good, he says, that it's appropriate for a person to eat, to drink, and to find satisfaction in their toilsome labor under the sun during the few days of life that God has given them, for this is their lot. Go, eat your bread with joy, drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already approved what you do. I didn't get a chance to really study that phrase, and I'm not quite sure the implication of that last little phrase. But again, enjoy life. This is what the writer is saying. And then I think it's interesting. This is what we're told in the New Testament. Interesting little text. Paul writes to Timothy, "Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God." And then this great little statement, "who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment." That's the Bible, guys. I mean, do you get that there? Don't you think that's cool? I mean, I used to think before I came to Christ that the whole purpose of Christianity was to make sure you didn't enjoy yourself, and yet, again, it's enjoy life. It's a gift. It's a gift. And there is that repeated message, I think, that you will see throughout the book of Ecclesiastes as you read it. Tip number 4, I'm just saying, is remember your mortality. When you get to the end of the book, Solomon begins to make some very interesting statements. And one of the first things that he really points out is simply the fact that we're all going to die. Now, the only exception to that is for anyone that happens to be living at the time that Jesus Christ returns and gets caught up in what's called the rapture, that there's one generation of believers that won't experience death. Could be us. But if it isn't, we're all going to die. And I think getting a grip on that is intended to give us sort of a sense of perspective on life. I think most of us don't want to think we're going to die. Now, I think that's at some strange level. Ernest Becker, a number of years ago, wrote a book called The Denial of Death. It won the Pulitzer Prize that year, by the way. And his thesis in that book was that all neurosis is a product of denying that you're going to die. So, cheery thought, yeah, I know, but again, we have bookends. We're born and we're going to die. And what was the very first lie of Satan? Go back to Genesis chapter 3, the very first lie, when he tempts Eve, she says to him, we can't eat because if we do, we're going to die, which is what God has said. And what does the devil say? Very first lie to humanity. You will not die. And I think he goes around kind of implanting that in a lot of people's brains. That, hey, you can just keep going forever. Well, we aren't going to go forever. And so it's interesting, like Stephen Covey in his great little book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, one of the habits is start with the end in mind. Okay? And what he says is picture your funeral, and what do you hope people are saying there? What do you want your kids to say? If your spouse is still alive, what do you want them to say? And he says, take that and work backwards from there in terms of what are you going to invest your life in. And I think that's a really healthy thing. And our lives are limited. And for some of us, we're coming to the end. I remember, I don't know how many of you know who Randy Pausch is. Randy was a professor at Carnegie Mellon University, and back in 2006, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And what he became known for is that he was asked to give a lecture there at the university, and he gave a lecture and really almost a little humorously entitled it The Last Lecture. Okay? And the things that he said in that lecture then eventually were written in a book called The Last Lecture, and it became a New York Times bestseller. But he made this statement, and I jotted it down in my little prayer notebook. He said this: "Time is all you have, and you may find one day that you have less than you think." And I think that's what Ecclesiastes is saying. You know, come to terms, remember your mortality. Now, final tip, and it's the biggest one, is simply this. Oh, here's some text on that. Because man is going to his eternal home, and the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. Again, that's the 8th verse. Here's the final one. I'm going to translate this a little bit. Solomon writes and says this. He says, "Remember your Creator in the days of your youth." I'm going to translate that to say, I think that the big message of the book is to keep God first. And as followers of Jesus and understanding the nature of the Trinity, I'm simply going to translate that as keep Christ first. It's the biggest tip in the whole deal. And when you get down to the very end of the book, this is what Solomon says: "Now that all has been heard, here is the conclusion of the matter." Now he's getting ready to give us the conclusion of the matter, right? At this, all right. Here's the conclusion of the matter: fear God, and that means reverence, reverential awe, and keep His commandments. For this is the duty of all mankind. It's the big takeaway. Embrace the Solomon solution, and wisdom, to paraphrase, wisdom keeps Christ first and follows the game plan. Okay? Obey His commandments. And in a world that oftentimes really doesn't make a lot of sense, this really will make sense. To keep Christ first and live in obedience to the game plan that He set forth in Scriptures. Put it together, prioritize the things that really count. Enjoy life. Be grateful when you can. Avoid the Solomon syndrome. Embrace the Solomon solution. And it brings us to our next exit, which will be Song of Solomon. And we'll pick up there after Easter, by the way. Dave's speaking next week. Palm Sunday and Easter, I'm going to break away and talk about the cross and the resurrection. So we'll get back to Song of Solomon the week after Easter, okay? Let's pray. Lord, I'm just grateful that this crazy little book is stuck there in the Old Testament, and that it really does try to give us a sense of perspective. My hunch is that for most of us, we'd at least like to try what Solomon tried, and maybe we don't take as seriously as we should what he tells us is true of so many of the things that we spend so much of our life pursuing. And Lord, we know that you provide all things for us. And Lord, that you want us to enjoy life in relationship with you. And pretty easy, I think, to get some of these things whacked and out of the way that you would want them to be. That if we keep you first and we live in obedience and we have the right kind of perspective on things, that possessions and power and wealth and all of those things, they play a role and they can be good. But again, we live in a world that certainly has got it out of whack, Lord. And we just pray that you would help us be men and women that seek you first and keep you first, live obediently, and enjoy life the way you intended it to be enjoyed. And we thank you for that. In Christ's name, amen.